Is everything in the universe made up of totally different things? Or is there like some kind of secret like partnership? Something deeper at play, even at the most basic level of existence? I mean, that's the kind of question that makes philosophy so interesting, right?
Yeah.
And today we're going on a special deep dive for you, our fellow philosopher, of course.
Yes. For you, we're going to be looking at a really interesting figure from the 11th century, Solomon Ibn Gabirol. He's also known as Avisopron. Get ready to look at a perspective that might not be as familiar as some of his contemporaries, but it really offers a unique perspective on, those classic philosophical questions.
Exactly. As someone who understands the intellectual landscape of the 11th century, you might know a lot about, say, Maimonides, right?
Yeah.
Or the Islamic philosophical tradition that engaged with the Greeks, for example.
Yeah.
But Ibn Gabirol, he really stands out. He's got an approach that's deeply rooted in that context, but also totally original.
He was an amazing person. He was a really famous Hebrew poet, and his philosophical work was just as good as his poetry. His main work, the Fons Vitae, which in English is the Fountain of Life, it's written like a dialogue between a teacher and a student, and that's what we're going to be using today. Think of it like an invitation to think about the most basic questions about existence, using a really unique intellectual framework.
And our goal today, for you again, a philosopher listening, is to dig up the core philosophical ideas in Ibn Gabirol's work. So today, we're particularly interested in his pretty revolutionary idea of universal hylomorphism. It's the idea that everything, even like our soul and intellect, is made up of matter and form. We'll also be looking at how important divine will is in his work, and how he places himself in the bigger Neoplatonic tradition. You're already familiar with this, but as a reminder, Neoplatonism is about the idea that all of reality comes from one ultimate source, the One. Ibn Gabirol's work uses ideas from thinkers like Plotinus, and maybe even the kind of mysterious pseudo-Empedocles, and that makes this even more interesting. Plus, there's a cool historical detail that his work was actually misattributed for centuries. That just makes it even more interesting, don't you think?
Yes.
Okay, so let's start by talking about Solomon Ibn Gabirol himself and when and where he lived and worked.
So Solomon Ibn Gabirol, he was probably born in Malaga at the beginning of the 11th century. And it seems like he had a pretty tough life. His parents died when he was young. And based on his poetry, it seems like he also maybe had some kind of skin problem, a visible one. He was part of intellectual circles and even had someone important supporting him for a while. But his social life seems to have been a little bit difficult. There's even this story, it might not be true, but it's really interesting. The stories that he built like a female robot. It's probably not true, but it's a cool story. Anyway, he died pretty young in Valencia.
He sounds like he was a complicated guy.
Yeah.
Like the fact that he was both a poet and a philosopher is interesting. It makes you think like his mind worked on all these different levels. He used both like rational thought and intuition. And it's amazing that we have so much of his Hebrew poetry and the Fons Vitae. It's like we can see his philosophical ideas through like a whole different angle.
It does, but we also have to remember that the Fons Vitae has a complicated history. We don't have the original Arabic version anymore. What we know about it comes from a Latin translation from the 12th century and a Hebrew summary from the 13th century. And each of these sources gives us, valuable but sometimes different perspectives and uses different terminology.
So like as good philosophers looking into this, we have to remember, right? We have to remember that there are all these different layers to the text, as we try to like reconstruct his whole philosophical system. You also mentioned that he was influenced by more than just the main Neoplatonic thinkers.
That's right. Neoplatonism, the idea that everything flows from the one, an idea you find in thinkers like Plotinus and in the theology of Aristotle, is super important in Ibn Gabirol's work, for sure. But his thought also shows that he was interested in Islamic intellectual traditions, and maybe even some Pythagorean concepts. But there's one influence in particular that's worth looking at more closely, and that is pseudo-Empedoclean thought. It's a bunch of philosophical ideas that are often connected to Empedocles, but they're actually found in a lot of like medieval Jewish and Islamic texts. And the main idea in these pseudo-Empedoclean texts is the idea of a primal matter. And this is what Ibn Gabirol calls alun unsur al-awal in Arabic, or yesod in his Hebrew poetry. Some scholars even think that it might be connected to a text called the Book of the Five Substances, which some people say Empedocles wrote.
So basically, he had a lot of different influences. Now, you said that it's important to not think about Ibn Gabirol using it just an Aristotelian framework. As we start to look at his own system, why is that so important for a philosopher to remember when they're studying his work?
Because if we try to force Ibn Gabirol's ideas into later systems, we might miss what makes him so unique. He uses words like matter and form, but he understands them really differently from Aristotle. He's much closer to the ideas of Plato and the Neoplatonists. And like we talked about, he includes this unique pseudo-Empedoclean element. So if we criticize him for not fitting into Aristotelian definitions, then we're missing the point. We're missing what he was trying to do with his philosophy and the specific questions he was trying to answer.
I see. He starting with different basic ideas and trying to solve different philosophical problems. What about the idea that he was influenced by Augustine?
Right. Divine will is so important in Ibn Gabirol's Fons Vitae that a lot of medieval Christian thinkers thought that he was an Augustinian. But just because they both talk about divine will doesn't mean that they understand it the same way. Ibn Gabirol's idea of will could actually fit in really well with the Neoplatonic idea of emanation. That's the idea of like a continuous flow from the divine. And that's different from Augustine's idea of creation ex nihilo. So if we see Ibn Gabirol through an Augustinian lens, we might misunderstand how he saw the relationship between God, will, and the cosmos.
Got it. And the third interpretive framework that you warned against is Kabbalah.
Yes, because Ibn Gabirol uses the Arabic word al-unsur, which sounds a bit like the Hebrew yesod, and that's a really important word in Kabbalah. So some people think that he was like a proto-Kabbalist, but scholars generally agree that his idea of yesod comes from that pseudo-Empedoclean tradition that we talked about. He's talking about a primal matter and not the more like mystical ideas that you see in Kabbalah. Later Kabbalists might have used some of his ideas, but if we think about him as a Kabbalist right from the start, then we're going to miss where his concepts really come from. Even Gershom Scholem, like one of the top scholars of Kabbalah, said that the connection between Ibn Gabirol and Kabbalah isn't simple. So it's really important to think about Ibn Gabirol on his own terms and try not to use later philosophical ideas to understand him, because they might actually hide his unique way of thinking.
Yeah. We need to understand his own system, right? Okay. So let's get into the core of his system. He says that universal hylomorphism is a key idea. Okay. So let's unpack that. For a philosopher thinking about what reality really is, what does Ibn Gabirol's universal hylomorphism actually mean?
Okay. So universal hylomorphism, according to Ibn Gabirol, means that everything that exists is made of matter and form. And that doesn't just mean physical things, like Aristotle said. It means everything, even spiritual things like the soul and the intellect. It's pretty radical to say that even the intellect has a material part. Think about how that challenges the usual dualistic idea that mind and matter are separate. It's an idea that's been around for centuries. And what does this mean for how we think about consciousness? This idea was really different from what people believed back then, and later it caused a lot of debate, especially among Christian thinkers. They were trying to figure out what angels are. Are they pure forms, like Aristotle said the highest intellect is? Or do they have matter too?
So even the intellect, which seems like it's not material, actually has a material part according to Ibn Gabirol. That's a big challenge to the classic mind-body dualism idea.
Right. And it's connected to his idea of first matter, which is al-unsur al-awwal, or yesod. But don't confuse this with Aristotle's idea of prime matter. That's like this inert potential stuff. Ibn Gabirol's first matter is different. He says that it exists on its own. It has one single essence. And it's the foundation for all the diversity in the universe. It's what makes it possible for all the different forms to exist. Think of it like the base layer of reality, It's what makes it possible for different forms to appear. And this idea comes from that pseudo-Empedoclean tradition, like we said. So it suggests that this first matter has a kind of spiritual quality to it.
So this first matter isn't just like this passive possibility. It's actually doing something in creation.
Exactly. Ibn Gabirol says that divine will brings this pure universal matter together with a pure universal form. And this first union is what creates the universal intellect. And from that first emanation, reality unfolds like a hierarchy. First intellect, then soul, then celestial body, and finally the terrestrial body, the physical world we live in. And each level in this hierarchy is a mix of matter and form, but they get more complex and specific as you go down.
And that brings us to the second key idea that you mentioned, the role of divine will. So if a philosopher is trying to understand how Ibn Gabirol's universe works, where does will fit in with matter and form?
Will is super important. Ibn Gabirol says it's a basic principle, just like matter and form, and even God's essence. It's like a bridge. Some people think it bridges the gap between God's transcendent essence and the world of matter and form. Others think that it's the link between matter and form themselves, the power that brings them together to make everything that exists. Notice how Ibn Gabirol's idea of will avoids both extremes. a totally detached deity and a pantheistic merging. Instead, it's a force that actively shapes and sustains reality. It offers a new way to think about how God acts in the world, different from, both classical theism and naturalistic views.
So it's the force that comes from God, and it makes the potential in the first matter real by adding form to it.
Exactly. Ibn Gabirol says will is God's power that's in everything, the force that unifies the universe. It creates and moves everything, and it keeps everything in existence. What's really cool is that he also says that divine will is the same as wisdom and word. So he compares creation to like God speaking. Universal matter is God's voice, the different forms are like the sounds God makes, and the universal form is the meaning of what God's saying.
That's a powerful metaphor. The whole universe is God speaking. So how does Ibn Gabirol understand God himself? Like, how does God relate to this creative process and to matter, form, and will?
Ibn Gabirol follows a kind of apophatic theology. That means he describes God by saying what he is not, because God is beyond human language and ideas. He says that God is a simple unity that we can't fully understand, but he also presents a dual or even a tripartite understanding of God. You have the hidden, unknowable essence, and then you have active will, which is also wisdom and word. So God is both totally beyond us and actively involved in creating the world.
So God is beyond our understanding, but also involved in how reality works. How does Ibn Gabirol connect the idea of creation, ex nihilo, creation from nothing, with these emanation metaphors, like the title of his book, The Fountain of Life?
That's a really subtle and debated part of Ibn Gabirol's thought. He does agree that God created everything from nothing, but he also uses these emanation metaphors, like water flowing from a fountain or a river of pure matter coming from God. One way to think about this apparent contradiction from a philosophical perspective is that maybe God first created matter and form from nothing, and then the universe became more diverse and organized through emanation, driven by the power of will and by matter and form coming together. The images he uses in his Keter Malkut, like God splitting open nothingness, and the idea of Ratson, divine desire, as a fundamental force matter is, like yearning for form, all of this makes his view even more complicated and interesting. So the question is, how do we really bring these different ideas together? Doesn't emanation mean that there was something there before? Even if it was divine, was there really nothing before creation? It's these kinds of complicated questions that scholars are still working on.
It seems like Ibn Gabirol is saying that the universe depends on a transcendent God, but it's also dynamic and everything is connected. Now, if we think about humans in this big scheme, what does Ibn Gabirol say is the purpose of human existence?
Ibn Gabirol doesn't think that these metaphysical ideas are just abstract thinking. He says that they're about understanding ourselves and our place in the universe. He believed that understanding what we are is essential for knowing how we should live. In the Fons Vitae, he talks about why humans were created, and he says it's to pursue knowledge and do good deeds.
So his metaphysics is about ethics and how we should live. It's not just about understanding the universe, but about our role in it.
Absolutely. Ibn Gabirol, like the Neoplatonists, talks about the return. The soul wants to go back to the higher, more perfect realms. It wants to be like its source. This return happens when the soul is freed from, he calls it, the captivity of nature, the limits of our physical bodies. And this happens through learning and being good.
This idea of a higher world and the return sounds a lot like Plotinus. But you said Ibn Gabirol adds something new to this Neoplatonic idea.
He does. He talks about reaching the level of first universal matter and being illuminated by its shadow. This is interesting because he believes that universal matter exists even at the highest levels, even above intellect. So the ultimate return for Ibn Gabirol isn't just pure illumination, but an illumination that has the shadow of the supernal first matter. The goal is to be free from death and to connect with the source of life. Even though we can't fully understand God's essence, Ibn Gabirol says that we can know God through how God shows up in the created world, especially through will and wisdom. It's a pretty powerful and mysterious idea that this first matter is active and wants form. And it makes you think, what does it mean that this fundamental desire shapes everything that happens?
And how does Ibn Gabirol's idea of the cosmos, his specific cosmology, fit with this idea of the soul going up and returning to its source?
He gives us a modified Neoplatonic hierarchy. In his Keter Malkut, he describes a cosmology where God is at the top. Then you have the sphere of intellect, which he puts as the 10th sphere, beyond the usual 9 spheres. Then the encompassing sphere, the zodiac and the fixed stars, the planets, and then finally Earth. And above the sphere of intellect is the divine throne, which he says is pure universal matter.
He puts the sphere of intellect as the 10th sphere. That's different from how other thinkers in this tradition thought about the intellect, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. Thinkers like Al-Farabi and Maimonides followed a Neoplatonized version of Aristotle's ideas. They said that the active intellect was the 10th and the lowest intellect. It's the intellect that's closest to our world and the one that's responsible for human thinking. But Ibn Gabirol, like Plotinus, focuses on a higher, more unified intellect that's closer to God. His whole cosmology is about understanding how the soul returns to this higher intellect.
So Ibn Gabirol believed that the whole structure of reality is about this journey of the soul back to the higher realms. We should also talk about the fact that Ibn Gabirol was a really important poet. How does his poetry connect to his philosophical ideas? It's fascinating to think about how his idea of creation as divine utterance might be influenced by his work as a poet. Do we see similar metaphors and themes in his Hebrew poetry?
His Hebrew poetry, both religious and secular, is full of his philosophical ideas. For example, his Keter Malkut is a beautiful poetic exploration of how we can't fully understand God and how God is present everywhere in the universe. And it's amazing, it's actually become part of the Yom Kippur liturgy. He also compares God's creation through word to how a poet writes, which makes us think about the nature of language, the self, and how we're connected to God. The fact that his Fons Vitae wasn't recognized until later in history and that people thought someone else wrote it shows how much non-Jewish interpretations have shaped how we see his work.
So to wrap up this deep dive into Ibn Gabirol's thought, we've looked at how he combines Neoplatonism with Pseudo-Empedoclean ideas, his idea of universal hylomorphism, which comes from a unique understanding of first matter, the super important role of divine will as the force that makes creation happen, and the big philosophical goal of understanding why we're here and the possibility of the Neoplatonic return.
Right. Ibn Gabirol is a really original and important voice in the history of philosophy. He makes us rethink basic ideas like matter and form, and he presents this really rich and fascinating view of how reality works. His ideas come from a specific time and place, but they can still connect with other philosophical traditions in surprising ways, and they also show us some really interesting differences.
Here's one last thing to think about. Ibn Gabirol's idea that first matter wants form. Does that give us a more interesting way to think about why the universe is so dynamic? More so than just mechanistic or idealistic explanations, how does this idea of a deep yearning at the very beginning of reality change how you understand cause and effect in the universe?
That's a great question. It's definitely something we're thinking about more. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the thought of Solomon ibn Gabirol. We really hope you'll keep exploring his work and discover how relevant his philosophical perspective still is today.